I'm Steven D'Alessandro, and my sport leader presentation was on Jackie Robinson. So for anyone who doesn't know who Jackie Robinson is, he was an infielder for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the late 1940s, early 1950s. His number 42 has been retired throughout all of baseball because of everything he did for baseball and for bringing African Americans into the league. He was very active in the civil rights movements, especially during his career and after, not necessarily before it as much because he wasn't as well known of a name to have that platform. He was most known for breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball. That's their way of saying he was the first African American to ever play Major League Baseball. Before 1947, none had. It was an entirely white sport, and he was the first African American in. Throughout his life, including his baseball career, he was heckled constantly for being an African American in a white field. He was born in 1919, so growing up, it was a predominantly white time where African Americans were very segregated. So he was constantly heckled for being African American. And the biggest thing towards his leadership style is that he never fought back. He wasn't the one to have violent outbursts against people who heckled him. He wasn't the one to talk back. He also wasn't the one to just grab a microphone and totally speak up and kind of provide that big speech like Martin Luther King Jr. did. So a little bit about his backstory. I mentioned he was born in 1919. He was born in Cairo, Georgia. So he was an African American born in the South. He did have 4 siblings. His mother also was an only parent, so she was responsible for raising the 5 of them. She also, because she was raising the 5 of them, didn't really have a job, so they were financially struggling from the time that he was born. But because of the wellness program in the United States, they were able to get a house in a neighborhood. But going back to the discrimination issue, they were putting a house in a all-white neighborhood. So he was facing discrimination from the day he was born by his neighbors. So after he got out of high school, he actually was able to go to college. He went to UCLA, where he was a 4-star athlete. He played baseball, basketball, football, and track. He was an All-American in football. Basketball, he didn't make the All-American squads, either first, second, or third, but he was a highly regarded prospect, and they thought he actually could be a pretty good basketball player. Even in track, he competed in the 1936 Olympic Games and finished second in the track and field run. Baseball-wise, they actually didn't think he was going to be a great baseball player. He was a kind of a big dude with big, broad shoulders. And a couple of people even went on record thinking that because of the broader shoulders, he wasn't going to be able to catch up to the fastballs. Obviously, they were wrong. After UCLA, he was only able to do about 2 years there because of financial difficulties back home. They just couldn't afford his tuition anymore. He decided to join the U.S. Army, and he started rising through the ranks pretty quickly. Within 2 years, he was second lieutenant. But again, discrimination kind of reared his ugly face back in. He was court-martialed because he was getting into fights and into disagreements and into arguments with fellow members of the Army because of discrimination they had against him. Eventually, he was given an honorable discharge and left the Army. After the Army, that's when he kind of started taking his baseball career. At the time, African Americans weren't allowed in Major League Baseball. They had their own league. It was called the Negro Baseball League. In 1945, he went and joined the Kansas City Monarchs, which at the time was the most well-known franchise in the Negro Leagues. Played for about a year, and then after a year, he was approached by Dodgers president of baseball operations, Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey had the idea of bringing him into the Brooklyn Dodgers and being the first African-American to play Major League Baseball. He did it. 1947, he debuted, went on to have a great career. He was National League Rookie of the Year, won the MVP in 1949, won a World Series in 1955, and was the first African-American elected to the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. He did go through a lot of challenges, though. When Jackie Robinson hit, he was on top of the plate rather than kind of being a little bit back, and people already wanted to throw at him because he was an African-American in the league. People were already gunning for his head. They were cleating him around the bases. They were stepping on his ankles. And instead of kind of backing off the plate a little bit and giving the pitchers their respect to pitch to him, he stood on top, instigating pitchers to throw at him. It was a decision of his. He typically didn't stand that close, but kind of wanted to prove he wasn't afraid of pitchers, of baseball, of getting hit. The decision easily could have backfired on him. At the time, people were throwing at his head. They didn't have the helmets they had nowadays. He easily could have been killed by a fastball to the head. Probably not the wisest decision then to instigate people who are already gunning at you. It also doesn't give you the best look. When he finally joined the Dodgers in 1947, the center fielder at the time, Dixie Walker, signed a petition with a bunch of Southerners who were living in Brooklyn at the time to not allow him on the team to play. It hurts even more when you have teammates who are supposed to have your back, who are actually stabbing you in the back, not wanting you to play. Thankfully, Branch Rickey had his back. They kind of squashed the petition right away. But it was showing that even from day one, a lot of people had a lot of objections to him playing, and he was already going to have a lot of challenges to overcome. When they traveled to Cincinnati, he was receiving death threats if he traveled with the team, if he played on the field, if he used the locker room. The death threats even went as far to his wife and his children as well. They really didn't want him to play there. The St. Louis Cardinals threatened to strike Major League Baseball if Jackie Robinson traveled with the team. They didn't want him in their stadium. They didn't want him in their locker room, their hotels, their restaurants. They did not want him there. The worst one, though, somehow out of death threats and threat of strike, the worst one that happened to him was in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, the team was very vocal about not having Jackie Robinson in the league. During a particular game, their manager, the other team, and the fans were all heckling him using derogatory terms and really starting to get under his skin. Jackie Robinson even went on record saying that was the closest he's come to finally snapping. But anyone who's seen the movie 42, there's a scene where he goes down into the tunnel through the dugout. He's ready to kind of break. Branch Rickey talks him down, and he keeps going. And it was another one of those moments where he easily could have broken. He could have given up. He could have let the violence come out, and he didn't. So after baseball, he decided to announce his retirement from the Dodgers. He realized his play wasn't up to par anymore, and he wasn't helping the team. Before he did announce his retirement, he actually was traded to the Giants for $30,000. And then in a magazine called Look, he actually released an article where he was announcing his retirement. At the time, then after that, the Giants offered him $60,000 to play for them. And people kind of started uprising and saying he was just announcing his retirement just so he can get a better deal out of the Giants, get more money. When he heard that, he made sure and kept his retirement, just to kind of prove he wasn't in it for the money or anything like that. He was always there to prove a point and to make a statement. After he retired too, he really started getting a lot into the civil rights rally and the civil rights activists. So he put a lot of support behind Martin Luther King Jr., publicly went on record to support him. He also went on record to support Richard Nixon. He felt that Richard Nixon was down to earth with colored people, got to know them, cared about them. While his running, the opposition to his running, John F. Kennedy, he felt that he really didn't care a lot about colored people. He really pushed the civil rights. At that point, he was a well-known figure, and he really used his platform to be able to get people to know more about civil rights and get a lot of equality. So when he came down to the important decisions that Jackie Robinson made in his career, probably the most important decision he ever made was not quitting baseball. It would have been really easy to see an African American come in, constantly get harassed, constantly get death threats, and end up just saying, enough is enough, I quit. And it would have probably demoralized African Americans and probably pushed back other African Americans playing in baseball for years and years and years. You know, his inclusion led the way to Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, and a lot of other great African Americans that came in the 50s and 60s. So if he gave up early, none of that probably would have happened. He kept persevering, he kept going through, he didn't quit, and that speaks a lot about the decisions that went through about going on every day. Another really important thing that he did was he testified before the House Un-American Actives Committee. In the 1940s, 1950s, they were a committee that was part of the House of Representatives that investigated discriminatory cases. His discriminatory case was actually against the New York Yankees. After he started in 1947, 5 years later, the Yankees were still the big powerhouse in baseball. They still did not have an African American on their roster. And Jackie Robinson went out publicly and called them out, calling them out for discrimination and racism. Then that's why they didn't still have a African American on their roster. So looking at the leadership of the qualities and the common leadership styles that go around, the best one that describes him is a charismatic leader. He wasn't the vocal one. He wasn't the one to go out and make the speeches, march in rallies or anything like that. He let his actions talk to him for themselves. After 1947, he became known all around the world. It was a record-breaking day. It was a big day for African Americans, and everyone knew who he was. But again, he wasn't the one to go out there and make the speeches. He let the actions talk for himself, being out on that field, not retaliating against all the discrimination he faced, and not quitting baseball. He gave a lot of hope to African Americans, and inspired them with passion, inspired them with motivation because he didn't quit, because he kept persevering. He gave inspiration to them that they can do the same. The most important thing also might be the other bullet in there that said he believed in himself. If you don't believe in yourself, there's no way he could have done what he did. He believed in himself, he believed in what he was doing, and he believed he could make a change. His personality and his actions are what drove people to inspire behind him, to rally behind him, to believe that they can go ahead and they can do things as well and not let discrimination hold them back. The biggest thing, like I said too, he led African Americans. A lot of, at the time, white males were more angry at him than finding him as a leader. They were the ones that didn't want him in the game. They're not going to appeal to his leadership style, his leadership qualities. They're not going to find him as a leader. They're going to find him more as a nuisance. It was African Americans that he really was able to lead. Like Martin Luther King Jr., he stressed nonviolence. People were harassing him. They were doing having death threats against him. They were threatening to strike against him if he participated. He didn't retaliate. He didn't curse at them. He didn't yell at them. He wasn't violent towards them. He just sat there and he played the game. He didn't let it show that everything that was happening was affecting him. All he did was he turned the other cheek and he set the example of the right way to do things. That is the biggest leadership quality that he has, is not fighting back. Obviously, it's going to affect you. His emotions did show, but he knew when to let his emotions show. He showed it when he was with Branch Rickey, when he was at his house with his wife and his child. That's when he really kind of let out a lot of his frustrations. But he never let the public see the weakness and let the fact that everything actually got to him. So his leadership, as you can kind of see on there, it stems from one thing. It's discrimination and the hate that he had from it. He started with discrimination at birth from the family that, the location where they were, surrounded by a bunch of white people, and finding a lot of frustration in that. Having to lead the U.S. Army because of discrimination against him and trying to stand up for himself. Having to play in the Negro Baseball League rather than playing in Major League Baseball. Actually having fear for the life of him, his children, and his wife. And then while he was in Major League Baseball, just a constant struggle for 10 years of every single game being a challenge. Everything he did came from the discrimination that he experienced throughout his entire life and wanting to end it. Overall, the biggest thing that Jackie Robinson understood was the importance of working together. And that came from working on a team, and it came from working with other African Americans to push the civil rights and gain their equality that they rightfully deserved. Even after he retired, he was still making waves of breaking color barriers. He was ABC's first Game of the Week analyst. He was the first vice president of a major American corporation, and he was the first African American co-founder of a successful bank in America. Even after he retired, he was making stride and leading the way for African Americans to get into different fields. At the end of the day, the leadership that Jackie Robinson had came down to his resistance of fighting back, setting by example, letting his actions talk for themselves, and continuing to pave the way for everyone to believe in themselves and believe in what they can do.